Janice, Edwards, it's showtime. It's time to Janice, Edwards, it's showtime. It's time to shine.
Welcome to Janice Edwards TV, Bay Area Vista, and I'm so glad that you're joining us today. Today on our show, we are talking with two retired colonels who are co-authors of a book entitled Paradoxes of Power, Failed Leadership and How to Fix It. And then in our next segment, we're talking with Janet Childs from the Center for Living with Dying about pandemic and national grief. So very excited to have you here with us today, and very excited to introduce our first two guests. We have retired Colonel and PhD Carl Hunt, who in addition to his work in the military, who has also worked with various government agencies. And then we also have retired Colonel Dennis Green, who has worked with the Air Force and other government agencies. And I'm happy to say that he's a longtime friend for more years than we can share on air. But gentlemen, thank you both for joining me and welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Delighted.
Glad to have you. So Dennis, because I've known you longer, I'm going to start with you. Tell me, how did you wind up creating an essay in Paradoxes of Power? And I know it was because of Carl's invitation.
Yeah, Janice, but writing this essay really brought me full circle. My grandmother marched with Dr. Martin Luther King back in the 60s. And because of it, I grew up understanding the importance of taking a stand for justice. So when Carl and I asked me to write this book as an extension of an essay that I wrote on LinkedIn about George Floyd's murder, I knew at that time that I had to contribute.
And it is a powerful essay. And so, Colonel Hunt, or may I call you Carl?
Certainly.
Okay. Carl, tell me about the concept of this, because you and your son, Josh, framed this, and then you invited a number of essayists from different generations to write. Why was it important to write this, and why did you want to make sure that you published it before the election last November?
The genesis of the book, Janice, actually was over breakfast, I should say, with Dennis, in trying to frame out the kinds of issues that we were facing. And as we talked through the mechanics of how we might pull together a book like this, I knew that it had to be targeted towards our younger generations. The idea of paradoxes of power revolve around the use and misuse of power in leadership positions. And I just felt like if we don't teach our younger generations what it means to acquire and exercise power and good leadership, we're really letting them down. And of course, we're harming significantly the future of the United States. So the authors that we pulled together represent a very broad spectrum, I think, of how power exists in a variety of organizations, how it comes to be in paradox, in other words, in situations where power is misused or abused. And the disciplines that it recognizes and harnesses in the book involve everything that Americans and indeed everybody in the West faces. So it took a real stable of geniuses, if you will, to define what power is in a leadership function, and then to speculate on how power is misused in settings such as politics, government, justice, economics, the environment, and even religion.
Yes, and it is comprehensive. I really enjoyed reading it. You delve very deeply and really break down a number of ways that power has been abused, and also what some of the solutions are. Certainly, as you wrote the book, there were forebodings. And Dennis, you wrote at one point when there was a suggestion in there about a constitutional convention in 2022 that things needed to be done to save our democracy. But did either of you foresee the insurrection of January 6th fomenting, and what were your reactions to it? Dennis, I'll start with you.
You know, Janice, Paul and I were just talking about how prescient the book is, because even though I'm not shocked and surprised, it still takes you aback when things happen like what happened last week with the insurrection. I, for one, really do know that our country will survive this. How we will survive it is going to be up to us. And I'll let Carl chime in.
Yes, and Carl, I know with your extensive Army background, what were your thoughts as you saw this happening?
It was, as Dennis said, not surprising. I think we've been leading up to this for maybe even 50 years, as we have debated among ourselves, what is the role of government? What is the role of political power in this country? And how do these other sources of power feed into it? For example, religion, economics, justice. And it really was the coming together of a lot of circumstances that as I believe, probably started at least 50 years ago, when politicians essentially decided we could split certain segments of the voting population, peel them off from their traditional roles, and bring them together in what I believe are very unfortunate power relationships. And this led to, I believe, what happened on the 6th of January. It was very disappointing, and even more disappointing to see some of the people that were actually involved with retired military and law enforcement, and just allowing themselves to be caught up in something that I hope they now regret. If they didn't regret it, it's going to be really difficult for us to come back from.
And that's part of the discussions that we hear that are so concerning, is that people are saying that there were so many veterans who are involved. You both, as veterans, know the sworn oaths to protect the country, but that this fraction now is not looking at it as though it's protecting the country. So with all of the threats, and even as we are doing this interview now, every day we're hearing about more potential threats and problems leading up to the inauguration. Realistically, what do you feel needs to happen? What is the wisest course of action to try to stop all of the violence that's going on?
At the foundation of this country, Janice, I believe we were able to come together more coherently because we were trying to escape the clutches of a monarchical dictator in King George. Today, and in recent decades, we have been running away from those kinds of arrangements and agreements and political philosophies, if you will, because we've ceased to find them serious enough to educate ourselves. I think our generations in the last few decades have not come to understand how important it is for us to be a cohesive, even if we are divided in certain perspectives and opinions, we are still founded to be a united States of America. And so what has happened in these last few decades has de-emphasized the role, the cohering role that government can play, and kind of allowed too many of us to be off on our own. And the implications for gender, for race, for economics, religion, all the topics we discuss in the book are enormous, I believe.
Absolutely. And Dennis, you wrote in your essay about Black Lives Matter. And as you mentioned, you were inspired to write the essay that led to your contributing to the book because of George Floyd's murder. Many people, of course, said that had this been a Black Lives Matter protest on January 6th, the outcome would have been very different. What are your thoughts about
Sure. And let me take a step back to finish up the prior question. I want to put a little personal spin on it. The people who were caught up in this insurrection, sadly, I'm a retired Air Force Security Forces officer. I've spent the last 25 years of my career in the federal government, both military and civilian, carrying a bag. It was very sad to see that um, the one of the individuals was a retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Security Forces officer who led the insurrection, as well as the young lady who died was also a prior Air Force Security Forces person. And the officer who was murdered was also a prior Air Force Security Forces person. So it really struck me to the core. And in relation and as it relates to Black Lives Matter, I really do believe that if the insurrectionists had been Black, Muslim, or of any color, we would see bloodshed that would be indescribable bloodshed. And I'm sort of pausing because it gets me choked up to even talk about just what may have happened. So that's my thoughts on it. I believe that we can get past this. It's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of education. It's going to take truth. And that's what we need right now, Janice. We need truth. We need truth and accountability. You know, I'm hearing a lot about, well, we need to move on. We need to reconcile. We need truth right now because truth precedes reconciliation.
Yes, and you spent time in South Africa where you observed how truth and reconciliation really changed the relationship between many Blacks and whites there. What did you observe?
I had the pleasure and um, opportunity as a Air War College student back in 2002 to actually travel to South Africa to work on my master's thesis. And the topic that I chose was 10 years after apartheid, how did they do it? How did they come together? Because South Africa gained their independence from apartheid in 1992. So I was curious as to how 10 years later they could have a nation that pulled together after all those years of civil war. So during my travel there, I talked to people on the ground. I talked to civic leaders. I talked to military leaders. I talked to people in their parliament. And so to wrap it up, as I put in the essay, I was on a flight from Johannesburg to Cape Town. And I sat next to a white businessman. And I just asked him, I said, you know, I'm really amazed at after 10 years how well your country pulled back together. And I and and he said that, you know, we had to come together as a nation. We had no choice. Otherwise we would not have a nation. And I asked him, well, how did that happen? And he said, truth and reconciliation. And that's what I took away. That was my major takeaway. And the way it happened there, you can Google the Truth and Reconciliation Councils. It's amazing to watch how that all came about how people will come into the public square and spill their hearts of all the guilt. And the public then was required to reconcile. It was a requirement to reconcile. There was no choice. and then they pulled themselves together. And yes, there were some, detractors. Was it 100%? No, but was it a great majority? Yes. And that's how they did it. And that's the format that we can use here in this country. It's what we have to use. And so that's why truth first is so important before we can reconcile.
Carl, your thoughts?
The idea of reconciliation and truth just resonate very strongly with me, Janice. Dennis and I have talked about this extensively. There's another element, though, that has to be inserted here, and that's trust. The trust in our societal functions, such as family and business and government, the things that nurtured us and brought us to where we are today. And having an environment of trust and truth, when we sit down to talk to each other about how we can come back together, how we can come back to being the United States of America, is absolutely critical. I'm a fan of the idea of the reconciliation uh, approach. However, I think we have a long way to go, which includes educating generations, maybe not too many, I hope, uh, on restoring faith and trust in the institutions that have made the United States capable of taking on the kinds of challenges we have. For example, World War II, putting a man on the moon, creating the incredible information technologies that we're using right now. All these things came about because we were able to build trust and true relationships among each other within our organizations. That is probably as much of a reason that we wrote the book in the first place, and to allow our younger generations access to information about how power works in these various organizations that I mentioned. But truth and reconciliation are significant components of how we come back together.
And in the book, also, you write about the losses related to the pandemic, which, of course, we can't separate from everything else. You're both fathers, and I wonder, what is it that you hope for your sons? What would you like for their lives to be like by the time that they're your age?
I had extensive conversations with my sons. And as a matter of fact, I gave my sons copies of the book. And they asked for additional copies of the book so they can share it with their peers, which is why we wrote this book in the first place, to get to the younger generations. And so my sons are in their 30s, and their co-workers were really impressed with what they read, and they learned something. They learned a lot. So they're on the right track, and the book was a good starter for that. By the time they get to my age, um, I want them to continue to vote. They didn't understand in their 20s why it was so important to vote. Now they do. They understand how power works. They understand the paradoxes of it. They even understand now why dad did some of the things he did. And now it even makes a little sense to them. It is a relief to me. So I'll let Carl go ahead and take the rest over.
It is fundamental for our younger generations to understand the kinds of organizations that we have built, that they are inheriting, and the power structures that exist within those organizations. If we can somehow figure out how to prepare them to take on these leadership positions, how to use power appropriately, our nation is only just beginning. The things that we can accomplish as a union, as a United States of America, are only just beginning. But if we continue to disregard what is happening within our organizations of all these varieties that we discuss in the book, I'm afraid that we're going to condemn ourselves to continually thrashing around looking for ways to overcome these power abuses and misuses that we've identified. It's supremely important that our younger generations understand this, as Dennis said.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you both for everything that you brought to us today in terms of the essays in the book, and offering hope in the midst of frightening chaos. So, again, thank you. And the book is Paradoxes of Power. The website is paradoxesofpower.com. Janet Childs is the Director of Education and Critical Incident Stress Response at the Center for Living with Dying, which is a program of the Bill Wilson Center. I've worked with Janet over the years doing many interviews. And Janet, so excited to have you here today. We first met after 9/11 at an ascertainment meeting when you talked about grief and how people are responding to that. So today I'm so excited that we're able to offer some tools to help people deal with the stress of everything that's happening in our world.
Well, we call it 360 grief because every area of your life is impacted. Every moment is informed by COVID-19, by racial inequity, by social injustice, by climate change, and by our natural disasters. So particularly in this year, we have been slammed. And I think it's so important that we acknowledge it, that we honor that these longstanding issues, as well as more recent issues, have created an entire change of our life. We cannot go out the door without being informed by how we need to respond to COVID-19. Generations of people have died. Family have lost their generational history and sometimes death or illness through COVID-19. And also, I think the wounding of racial inequity has finally, the scab has been pulled off. And we're finally being able to see that we need to do a lot of healing. And I think the first step is acknowledging. It's very interesting, Janice, you were talking about 9/11. I was talking with some of my friends that I've met in New York City after responding to that incident almost 20 years ago. And one woman said it very powerfully to me. She said, "You know, Janet, I know you and I love you. And I've, been with you for these 20 years. But she said, if I were walking down the street as an African-American woman and you're an older white woman, I wouldn't know what to expect from you. I would have to be aware and I'd have to watch out." And that broke my heart. But she's absolutely right. And so we need to do a lot of healing. And we start off by acknowledging what it is that we are dealing with and acknowledging the massive changes that have happened. We can build resiliency, but we first have to acknowledge the loss and the grief. And our center, which is now 45 years old, has been doing grief response and support for those 45 years. We have worked with over 1.5 million people. And there's a common human experience, and that is we will all experience loss and grief. And if we can come together, and although we have to physically distance for your health and well-being and mine, we do not have to socially distance. We can connect with each other socially in whatever media we can use. And I encourage that because the power of us staying connected takes care of the two things that make stress and grief and 360 grief worse. One of those is isolation, and the second is feeling out of control. So in stress and grief management and in building resiliency, we need to get ourselves from out of control to in control in any little way that we can, and to get ourselves out of isolation and into community. Because as community, we can build. Now, what has happened, with the insurrection that occurred last week is that it threw us all into a state of trauma, not only about present critical incidents, but also it has tapped into our backpack of past incidents that we may have survived, that we may or may not have had the opportunity to work with. And so it is so important in acknowledging that we also have the safe place to express the details of how we have been impacted and affected, and to be able to come together and bear witness to each other in that moment of how we can support each other and then to do an action step. One of the things, Janice, you know that I use a lot is candles. And before my brother died, he taught me how to make the origami crane. And it's become a universal symbol of hope and healing and peace. And with your permission, I would just like to fire up this candle for all of us, because each of us brings a unique light to the work, and we need each other's unique light to work together, to support each other, to bear witness to each other, and to be able to reconnect to what is still good, what is still strong, what is still resilient.
That is so beautiful, Janet. And I remember when your brother passed, and that tradition of lighting a candle is so meaningful. You helped me with that with my mom's passing as well. So I thank you. It was wonderful to have you with us. Thank you for the tools that you've provided to help us navigate all that we're grappling with right now. Again, Janet Childs from the Center for Living with Dying, which is a program of the Bill Wilson Center. And that's our show. I'm Janice Edwards. Thank you for all that you do to make our world a better place. Please join us again next time. We look forward to seeing you then.